And then last but not least, women's Bible study. I've known Brandy, you guys have known Brandy for years. She has dedicated herself to the women's Bible study. She meticulously goes through the curriculum, making sure that it's very good content. And it's a lovely group that meets at the barn on Thursdays. So if you want to sign up for that, she's back there during the break. We're going to have a 2-minute break. You can talk to people, get coffee, hang out until live music comes up. Or you can sign up on Thursdays for women's Bible studies. Okay, I think that's all I got for you. You'll hear the live music and you can come back.
Skylar? Oh, Skylar, I have one more announcement. You know, we can work with the hat, but man, the socks got to go, dude.
That's boo.
Up there. So we're going to jump in to 1 Peter again. We're hitting more themes than line by line, and in doing so, we're jumping around a little bit. And I'm going to jump back to something, at least start there, where Skylar talked about a month or so ago. And that's in 1 Peter 2, and we'll begin in verse 13, where it says, "Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether the king as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him, that is the king, and ultimately God, to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men." And then he says in verse 16, "Live as free men," or just free people. It was more generic in the first century to say that. "But do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God and show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood," your fellow Christians, the brotherhood of believers. "Fear God," because that is, as Proverbs says, the foundation of wisdom, of a wise life. And then he says, "Honor the king." We'll cover more than that, but I wanted to start there and draw your attention in particular to verse 16, where he says, live as free men. The Apostle Paul would say something similar when he says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free." Those of us who are Jesus followers, he's set us free to know and to love him, to be free from our sin, to be free to be reconciled with our Father in heaven, to be free to become, because he puts his Spirit in us, and as we cooperate with the Spirit of God in us, to become the best version of us, the people that I think deep down we long to be, and certainly the people that have to live with us, they don't have to go that deep even to want you to become the best version of you. And so he says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Peter says, live as free men. Both people hit on this really, really, really important theme in the Christian life. The theme of freedom. But both the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul will address, in those two references, one from Galatians with Paul and then here in Peter, he will address the abuses and the perversions that are so commonly associated with the concept of living this new life, this life of freedom, as they said. And Paul will say it this way in Galatians. He'll talk about how people will pervert it with legalism. It's Jesus plus something. So yeah, God will forgive you. Jesus died on the cross. Okay, we're okay with that, but you better make up the difference. It's about what you do for him. It's Jesus plus something. For them, it was some of the Old Testament laws of circumcision or diet or special days. And if you didn't toe the line, you couldn't be right with God. If you wanted to know freedom, you had to become a slave to Jesus plus some rules. And we call that legalism. And so he writes that book of Galatians to counter false teachers who were promoting and promulgating that very message. And he has a really stern and harsh view of that, and you can check it out in Galatians sometime if you haven't. Peter will address, when he's talking about this subject of freedom, something maybe you would think about at the opposite end of the spectrum, the perversion of what it means to live free in Christ. And he would say in that 16th verse after he says, live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil, he says. Don't use your freedom for a cover-up for evil. Instead, he says, live as servants. So he's addressing something maybe you would think about at the other end of the kind of the polar opposite. On the one hand, you have the legalist, Jesus plus some rules. We don't dance. You can't dance. I mean, how could you do that and be acceptable to God? And then on the other end, you have the antinomian. So antinomos, the Greek word for law, is like scoff law, and that's an old word too. I've used it, and people go, what does that mean? You know what it means to scoff? It's like rules, schmools, laws, rules, standards. And there were those that Peter was contending with, false teachers who were teaching just that, this kind of antinomian, anti-law. I have Jesus now, I have my insurance policy, just get back to living the way you were, indulging your selfish appetites and desires. And so people were teaching that. In fact, he'll later address that, and I'll talk about that in just a second here. I'll go to Paul first. I should even have said that. I should have just gone to Peter. Peter will address that in that second letter of his, 2 Peter, where he'll talk about the false teachers that were promoting just that kind of lifestyle. You have Jesus, now do whatever you want. Live like you did before. And he would say about the people who would promote that kind of false teaching as being like springs that have no water. He would say they're like a storm's rolling in and you really need the water in this arid desert land they're in, but all you get is a mist. They can't deliver on the freedom that they promise. Indulge your appetites. He says it doesn't lead to freedom. They promise you freedom. He says, but they themselves are slaves. And he says they entice people who are just escaping that empty way of life and say, hey, being antinomian, that's kind of our culture, isn't it? And it's where I used to live, and many of us, because I thought it was the good life, it was the free life. But it turns out it wasn't. And so Peter will say, man, don't go back to that life. And Paul will say, on the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, don't go back to living by the rules and thinking that somehow that makes you better or closer, more acceptable, more loved by God than the people who don't do those things. Because both are a perversion of the gospel of Jesus, and both will keep you from the freedom that he wants for his children. And I was just, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, so in the day and age in which we live, I know what it was like me growing up. We had a long list of Jesus pluses, and it wasn't just because they were not good for human flourishing. They were just standards from bygone years that somehow we associated with being someone who loved and was acceptable to God. Jesus plus a suit and tie on a Sunday. I mean, he still frowns on socks and sandals, but but it made us feel superior then to those who didn't. It's kind of cute and sad, both. When my parents, we were putting together, I think, like a 70 or 75th wedding anniversary for them, and her younger sister, who is way more legalistic than we are back there in Maryland than we are here, certainly than the McCartans are, and she was sending this little video, congratulations, we can't come or whatever, and then she's just trying to think of stuff to say, but she can't help herself. The legalism just leaks out. She says, there's not going to be dancing. Thinking like, why in the world? It's like, congratulations, 75 years, who makes it? There's not going to be dancing. Oh, that's right, it's a church. Of course there wouldn't be dancing. Because, you see the dancers and you see us, right? You see the difference? And so Paul is addressing that and saying, man, you've got to be on guard. There are two extremes that will keep you from living the life of freedom. And you know how Paul will say it? He'll say it this way to the legalists. He'll say, nothing counts except your faith, which is your trust in Jesus, expressing itself. So your trust in Jesus and his love for you and his acceptance for you, and that he is the smartest man, God-man that ever walked the planet, and he's right about everything, and you can trust him no matter what he has to say about how to order your one life. And that should make you so filled with gratitude that he could forgive and accept someone like you and into his family as a son that he couldn't, or a daughter that he couldn't not love. He loves you the most even when you're at he loves you even when you're at your worst. Like my Margot, my granddaughter. You mind if I use a granddaughter illustration here? Well, tough. That's all I got anymore. And even when she's naughty and fussy or whatever, I still don't love her any less. And Paul is saying, you know what really counts is when you get that and an appreciation for that love and that acceptance and that security you have in Christ expresses itself in love. And as Peter says, in serving other people that are stamped with the image of God as well. And that's really the good life, the free life, the life that he's called us to live a life of freedom. But make no mistake about it, freedom that expresses itself, as Paul said, in love, or as Peter said, that has this humble heart of a servant because God's been so good to you, is not for the wimpy or the cowardice, or it's not a spineless rolling over and serving others and I'm just a worm. It's quite the opposite, actually. It actually requires a good deal of perspective on the big picture about what really matters and what really is going to last, and it really requires a good deal of courage. And that's what Peter is addressing here. And so a life that's a life of, the easiest thing to do is to live a life of checking the boxes, the religious boxes. You know, I don't do this, don't do that, do this, I'm better than others, God certainly must. It's Jesus plus that, and I've checked the boxes, and it's curious how everyone has a different set of boxes, the ones that you have the most affinity for, but that's easy, to be accepted, you know, to go with the flow, to run with the pack, to be accepted by those who are similar box checkers. And Peter's saying, and Paul are saying, that's not the life of freedom. And Peter's saying, neither is antinomianism, neither is covering up for indulging your selfish appetites, you know, your selfish and sinful appetites. And he'll say in that second, I don't know if it's the second or first letter, I forget now, but in the second letter, when he's talking about those false teachers, he'll say that you've escaped that. Why in the world would you go back to living the way that you did, the way that you lived before, that was on that broad path that Jesus said leads to not to human flourishing, but to a stifled life, ultimately to death, leads you away from God. And so that's the easy thing to do, you know, to be a box checker, or to just say, oh well, I got my insurance policy, I'll just live as I did or as I want. He said both just are lives of bondage. Why would you want to return to that? That's not what Christ set you free for. And so there are, like, and you know this, the world, the flesh, the devil, you've heard it, all right, if you've been in church very long. We have three formidable forces that work against us living a life of freedom, that would draw us into the bondage of legalism or into the slavery of antinomianism. And those are our fallen nature, you know, our just own selfish passions and desires. I don't even need to elucidate that because, I mean, who doesn't get that? And so Peter says, man, don't waste your time anymore chasing after that empty life. And Isaiah the prophet, the Lord would speak through him to his people and say, why would you spend your money, or why would you spend your time? Why would you spend your one life chasing after things that can never meet your deepest needs, that will never deliver on what it promises, will never connect you in the way that you most deeply long to be connected with God and other people? Why would you do that? That's slavery. And that's why most people get to the end of their life and they just think, man, woulda, coulda, shoulda. And so Peter says, man, And don't do that. Don't waste any more of your one life chasing after that stuff, even though you have these impulses that you're going to need to resist. And it's not easy, is it? God certainly helps us. That's his promise. And then, of course, there's the devil. Peter will talk about that in the 5th chapter of this very letter. He'll say he prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to not eat his lunch, but to eat for lunch, to enslave you, to keep you from the freedom that we're addressing here this morning. And then thirdly, we live in a broken and fallen world, selfish world, that entices us to indulge our appetites, or to be a box checker and to feel superior, to kind of run with the pack, to join the herd of lemmings. And you know how that ends, right? You do know that. If not, why don't you do a Google search on that, but don't use Google. Use one of the other search engines, because I'm not a Google fan. See the difference? You Google and you see me. I don't. See the difference? See the superiority there? And this is where Peter's going to land. I mean, you live on a broken planet. And you better be aware of that. Keep your head in the game. And what he'll do is he'll illustrate like 3 areas of your life where we're living this life of freedom. We're living as a grateful servant of Christ in the way that we relate to other people in this broken world. He says there's going to be this gravitational pull from the culture, and he'll illustrate it with 3 arenas of life. Your relationship to the government, your relationship, and he won't say it this way, but that would certainly be the application in the day in which we live, your relationship to your work life, and then marriage. Now, and he's going to talk about the struggle associated with those 3 areas, and it'll be hard for us to relate to having any difficulty in those 3 areas, right? The government, work, or marriage, family. Probably not, huh? In all 3 arenas, he's going to stress the importance that we are going to encounter difficult people and difficult circumstances and institutions that are not functioning the way that God has ordained for them. And here's the takeaway. I mean, I guess if this is all you get, and I suppose you could leave right now after I say this, but we won't be that long, so you might want to stick around. And here it is. It's like in light of the forces that are kind of arrayed against us as we do life on a fallen and broken planet, then you need to be the kind of person who says, okay, Lord, as I encounter things that aren't as they should be, this suffering, this persecution, this inconvenience, these annoying people, God help me to not lose sight of you. And God help me not lose sight of my mission. And God help me not lose my message in the midst of all of this. God help me not lose sight of you, not lose sight of my mission in this one brief life, or lose my message to people who are knowing or not, so in need of the gospel, the good news of Christ. And so then basically what he's saying is, because that's our goal, we don't want to win an argument for Jesus. We want to order our lives so that we can win people to Jesus. And so he'll say in this section, as he did, try to honor everyone. Do the best you can to come up with some measure of honor and respect for everyone, because everyone's been stamped in the image of God. Everyone matters to him. Everyone's going to spend eternity somewhere. Don't lose sight of the mission. Don't lose sight of the message. And so treat people with honor and respect, and that is so much easier said than done. Seriously? Does Peter have any idea who I work for or with or live with, or what in the world's going on? Is this an election year? I couldn't really tell yet. I thought this was supposed to be an election year. Or the chaos in the government and in the streets. And don't lose sight of your mission. Don't lose sight of the Lord. Don't lose your message in the midst of all of that. And so he'll use these 3 areas, these 3 arenas. So Skylar talked on this, and we won't belabor it, but that of being a good citizen. Because ultimately God established civil government. and ordained that. And then he'll tell us exactly what the purpose of that is to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. That should be like the goal of government. But does it seem like that gets a little upside down to you? It seems like they're rewarding the unrighteous and punishing the righteous oftentimes. Is it just me? I saw some clips this last week. This young mom in I guess a junior high football game in Ohio, and the stands are almost empty. I mean, 15 people in all the grandstands or so, and she's just with her family, and they arrest her and take her off in cuffs for not wearing a mask. Now, if you've seen the clip, I'm not commending her resistance of being put in cuffs and carted away. But what I am kind of curious about is how I can watch so many clips of Portland or LA or other cities where people without masks are in the face of police officers just inches away, shouting every conceivable kind of grotesque obscenity they could, and flying fingers and Molotov cocktails or whatever. And then I was saying going home at night and getting in their bed, but actually they're going home in the morning and getting in their parents' bed. But it's like, how is it that they're not in cuffs? I mean, so, things aren't in a broken world as they should be always. And so, if that's the case now, how much more so, as you know, at the time that Peter's writing this, where the evil Emperor Nero, psychotic, really, psychopathic, I mean, we've talked about it. I mean, he would actually have Christians slaughtered in the arenas, what do they call those? The gladiatorial games, slaughtered and consumed by wild animals, and notorious for actually strapping Christians to a pole, covering them in resin and wax or whatever is flammable while they're alive, lighting them to light up his garden parties. And Paul is saying, try to treat everyone with some measure of honor and respect. And especially in regard to those who have authority over you. Remember when the Apostle Paul was being dragged before the Romans and before the Jewish religious leaders, and they wanted to kill him because he was preaching about Jesus, and they dragged him before the high priest, and he didn't know. And he started to talk about Jesus, and one of the guards pops him in the chops, and he said, at the order of the high priest Ananias, he said, God will punch you in the teeth too, or something along that lines. He said, how do you talk to the high priest like that? He said, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was the high priest. It was illegal for him to get stricken like that. But he wanted to, he appreciated that you need to try to have some measure of treating people with honor and respect, because you don't want to lose sight of the fact that God's in every struggle you have, and he can identify with all your suffering, and he's not abandoned you, and he can ultimately use it, and you don't want to lose sight then of your mission or the message. And so Peter is saying something that would have been even more difficult than it would be for you if you're not a Trump supporter, or if Kate Brown makes your skin crawl. He says, as Jesus followers, man, try to relate in a way that has some measure of honor and respect, because you don't want to lose sight of the bigger picture, and that is that more than anything else, people need Jesus. Even when they're wrong and things are upside down, you work to make them right by appealing to a higher law, the law of God and his value. The second thing he talks about here is servants or slavery. So let's read that as we continue here in verse 18. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to do good, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if you do good and suffer for it, you do good and suffer for it, you endure. This is the gracious thing. As someone who is identifying with Jesus, who doesn't want to lose sight of his mission or the message, if you show some honor and respect, as best as you can, you're doing the gracious thing because people are broken and lost and need Jesus. Verse 21, for to this you have been called because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. This is the world in which Christianity was birthed. In the Roman Empire, some would estimate that upwards of 50% of the population was made up of slaves and servants and bond slaves or bond servants. And it wasn't just like the Roman Empire. This has been true of the percentages may be different, but true of almost all cultures forever, since the beginning. Remember the story of Joseph? He was sold by his brothers into, remember? Slavery. Remember the children of Israel, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph in Egypt for 400 years. As they multiplied, they were slaves. Remember Daniel? He was a prisoner of war, right? And carted off to Babylon. And so, in the early days of the empire, that's where these slaves of the Roman Empire, that was the majority of slaves, were prisoners of war. And so that's one of the categories of slaves that made up 50% of the population. It was the largest category, especially in the beginning. And then there were the slave traders, people who were just bought and sold. And we think about that like in the early days of America or in Europe, kind of a race-based slavery. It wasn't so much race-based, but people were treated like things, like possessions. They had no rights. They couldn't even marry. They could cohabit, they could produce children, but those children belonged to the master. That's the broken world in which the church was birthed. And of course, that isn't just something that's unfair, it's something that's offensive to God because everyone matters to him. Everyone's made in the image and likeness of God, as the scripture teaches. And that's why Paul would write to Timothy and he would list slave traders, people who treat people as things and as property, as cattle. He said those are among the things that why Moses wrote his law. Those are the things that are so completely out of step with the gospel, like murder, slave trading. It's not as though God was for it. He hated it. It's offensive. And then there was a third category, which were bondservants, and that's probably a category that we could more relate to. These were people who, for economic reasons, for the most part, would enter into some contractual agreement with someone. They needed to make a livelihood. They needed to provide for the family and really couldn't, so they would indenture themselves, not as forever slaves, but for some period of time, to live on the estate of somebody who had means, and they would serve at his pleasure. And it not just necessarily menial tasks. I mean, they served as doctors and teachers and all sorts of professions. They might even have learned one. And yet, for a period of time, they had to work off that debt. It's sort of like the GI Bill, right? You go and serve in the army for a certain amount of time, and then we'll pay for your schooling. Or maybe you know some doctors who serve in a rural community, and after they graduate and do their residency, and for a number of years, if they'll go to a place where it's hard to get a doctor, they'll cancel their debt, or they do that. Maybe some of you teachers, that's why you're here in Sweet Home, in East Lynn County, because you were in some sort of contractual arrangement where if you served for so many years. And so this was the context in which Peter is addressing this issue of slavery. And that's why Paul would write, and probably referring to bond slaves, and Skyler, I think, referred to this, I know he referred to this last week, when Paul was saying, if you're a slave, if you can, get out of it. If you can't, finish your contract, appreciate that you're working not for men, but for the Lord, and treat those that you're under with respect and honor, because everyone matters to God, and you don't want to win an argument for Jesus. You want to win people to Jesus. So think about how you're treating people. And I think this gives rise to the question of civil disobedience. When do we just say, I was going to do hand motions, but I caught myself, thankfully. When do you say, hey, heck no, we won't go. When do you resist? And how do you resist? What's the God-honoring way to do that? Is Peter saying that under abuse of authority you just need to say and do nothing? Is that it? We're just to be doormats? Silent doormats? And here's the rule, I think, that is the biblical rule. We should submit to authority unless it forbids what God commands, or it commands what God forbids. We should yield to the authority that's over us in this world, and in a submissive and an honoring kind of way. Now, submissive doesn't mean doormat, but it means, I'm going to, it's good. It's not easy. It takes someone who really sees the big picture. It takes someone who's not a coward to say, I'm going to kind of humble myself and look to your best interest. That's what this idea of subjecting yourself or submitting yourself. It's not, you just be the worm that people can stomp on. It's to be a man and woman enough to see the big picture and have the courage to not forget about God or lose sight of the message or lose sight of your mission. And so, let me give you some examples. When authority, like in China, would have a one-child policy and they would say you need to kill your unborn child, you would say, homie, don't play that. That's what you would say. Because I appeal to a higher authority and I cannot comply. Or when they say you can't have church, or they say you can't read your Bible, you're not being an anarchist. You're not saying there's no law. You're just saying I'm appealing to a higher law, and the degree to which I can, I'm going to try to fix it, to vote them out, to sign a recall. But there's some things I can't compromise on. And I'm going to do that in the most God-honoring way that I can. Remember Daniel? What was it? The story with Daniel was that at one point in his being exiled, taken as a prisoner of war to Babylon, was that he defied this order that for a certain, 30 days you couldn't pray. And you know what he did? He stood in his window 3 times a day, and he bowed towards Jerusalem and to the true God Yahweh, and he prayed. Because there were just some things, that you can't forbid. And I cannot yield. His 3 buddies, the king makes this 30-foot high statue and says that everyone has to bow before it. But there were 3 courageous young men, you know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who would not bend the knee. And then, if you know the end of the story, they end up ultimately in a fiery furnace. And here's what they said to the king. They go, and if you read it there in Daniel, you just get the sense that they're doing the very thing Peter is saying to his audience and God to us 2,000 years later. Try to muster up some measure, some modicum, some smidgen of respect for the unrespectable, honor for the dishonorable. Because people have been stamped in the image of God, and your goal in life is to, as best as you can, be salt and light and share this message in a broken world that needs Jesus so. The midwives in the story of Moses and the bulrushes kill all the Hebrew first males. And the Hebrew midwife said that would be against the higher law of God, and they did not. Had I produced some notes, and I'll probably use this when we post this online, and we are behind, and I apologize for that, and I have lots of excuses for it, which are the skin of a reason stuffed with a lie. But when we do, I'm going to use that cover. Remember Keith Green in that album cover, some of you, where it's got everyone's bowing down, and then there's one person standing. And they're not standing like this. They're standing in humility, as respectful as they could muster, and to say, we can. We appeal to a higher law. And to me, it just so captures what Peter is trying to get at here. Did Paul practice civil disobedience? Yeah. He was in jail for not going for not marching with the lemmings when he wrote Colossians, Ephesians, and Philemon. Peter in Acts 5, some of you know it and know it well, especially in the day in which we live, where you just think like, at what point do we just say, we can't go there? You know, with your dictates and your orders and decrees, we respectfully decline. And so Peter was warned, don't do it. You know, it would be a costly mistake on your part. And you remember what he said in Acts 5, we must obey God rather than men. And so the issue really is who do I want? Whose ultimate acceptance do I want? What is the ultimate end goal and purpose of my life? Is it, as Peter is addressing here, people who just go like, you know, just live for comfort, man. Just indulge yourself. Life's short, go for the gusto. Is that it? It's the way many people most people outside the church and far too many inside the church live. Wouldn't you agree? I could give you so many more examples of people who, like St. Patrick, who was a slave in Ireland. He was captured, taken to Ireland, and he ultimately escaped, and he returned to Ireland. You know why? He wanted to preach the good news of Jesus Christ, and in doing so, see that slavery was a thing of the past. William Wilberforce, who was the driving force that led to the abolition of slavery in Great Britain, was a Jesus follower. 2/3 of the abolitionists in the United States who fought against slavery in our country in the 1800s were Jesus followers, as was Rosa Parks. You know the name, right? Or Jackie Robinson or Martin Luther King. You know, there was civil disobedience, where they said, we appeal to a higher law. And they did it in a way that was as respectful as they could muster. And none of us do it perfectly. There are no perfect people. Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s, when he ran for president, ran on the platform of the abolition of slavery. And only 10% of the United States people owned slaves. And that was a part of the platform. And in so doing, 11 states declared that they were withdrawing from the Union. And of course, the bloodiest war ever fought by the United States was fought for 4 years in that war. 620,000 people died, and an innumerable amount of people who survived without limbs and disabled in a 4-year war. Compare that to the Iraq war, about 4,400, I believe, or the 16-year long Vietnam War, where 58,000 U.S. citizens died. This was over 600,000 people died in a conflict that ultimately couldn't be avoided. So this is what we're running for. This is what we're voting for. And then a bloody civil war broke out. And so Peter's concern was that Christians in a broken world where government gets upside down and sideways, maybe more often than not, where in your work life, if you will, applying it to today, things aren't always fair. In this world, you're going to experience suffering. And so Peter says, man, don't lose sight of God in it. And he'll actually use in his third illustration, and I won't really be able to take the time to read it. He'll talk about marriage, where the husband isn't a believer, and probably it doesn't matter whether they entered into it unequally yoked, as the Bible says don't do. Where the wife actually is wanting to live for Jesus and love Jesus, the most important thing in her life, and her husband could care less. And he's saying, well, don't give yourself to nagging him, because no one ever gets nagged into anything. But rather, with a gentle, respectful, honoring way, live out Jesus. Because if you keep your eyes on him, and purpose not to lose sight of your mission and the message, You're going to find yourself being able to walk that, that kind of fine and difficult. I'm not saying this is easy or there's some clear pat answer for everyone in their circumstance. But I do know this, that whatever that is for you and in your life right now, I don't know what you're dealing with, but most of us are dealing with something. If not, get ready. Don't lose sight of Jesus, because he suffered, and we'll come back to this, because Paul will belabor this. You keep your eyes on Jesus. He actually entered into a world of suffering because he was on mission. And dissuade him as his detractors as well as his proponents wanting, to have some other agenda, where he just kind of opens up a can and takes over. But that wasn't his mission. His mission was to bear your sin and my sin. And when he went to Jerusalem to do just that, his friends tried to dissuade him, but he set his face like stone towards his mission. And he was abused and mistreated, and he suffered. His lifeblood was bled out on that cross. And even on that cross, you know what he would say? Father, forgive them. And so Peter will say, man, look to Jesus. Don't lose sight of Jesus. Don't lose sight of your message. Don't lose sight of your mission. Because people matter to God. And in a broken world, we need to do all that we can to be as persuasive, as Jesus would say, salt and light, as we can. And so let's pray. Father, I pray that you would help us. And I don't know where everyone is in their journey, but I know that probably most of us can relate to some people or some institutions that just aren't as they should be, and there is this just strong temptation to not conduct ourselves in the most winsome, productive way. And God, I know the enemy of our soul would love for that. He would love for your name to be slandered in the way that we relate to people. And sometimes that has to be with respectful disobedience, non-compliance. But God, I pray that you would help us, whatever that circumstance is, God, to not lose sight of you, to not lose sight of the big picture, that people matter to you, that they've been taken captive by the enemy of their soul, and that the church is the best hope for this world and the message of your gospel. Help us, I pray, in Christ's good and strong name.
Awake my soul and sing of this love that set you free. Awake my soul, awake my soul, awake my soul and sing of this love that set you free. Awake my soul, awake. Have a great week.